Chapter 19 of The Sinking of the Titanic. Written by J. Henry Mowbray. Published in 1912. Narration by Ambience World. Managing Director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay. Captain Rostrom, of the Carpathia, Guglielmo Marconi, inventor of wireless, the second officer of the Titanic, and others testified before the Senate committee, which was investigating the disaster that caused the loss of more than 1,600 lives, when the Titanic hit an iceberg. Mr. Ismay was visibly nervous when he took the stand to testify in the Waldorf Astoria, where the hearings were being held. Several times, he avoided direct answers by saying, "I know nothing about it." Little if any light was thrown on the sea tragedy by his testimony. That the Titanic's rate of speed was approximately 26.5 land miles, was brought out from his lips. He was not sure in just what boat he left the Titanic, nor was he sure how long he remained on the liner after she struck. He added, however, that before he entered a lifeboat, he had been told that there were no more women on the deck, and he denied that there had been any censorship of messages from the Carpathia. The seriousness of the inquiry by the Senate Investigating Committee in the Titanic disaster was disclosed when Senator Smith, of Michigan, the chairman, at first, flatly refused to let any of the officers, or the 200-odd members of the crew of the sunken steamship, get beyond the jurisdiction of the United States government. The men were all to have sailed on the steamer Lapland. Later, it was settled that the greater part of the crew would be permitted to sail on this steamer, but that the 12 men and 4 officers, among the survivors now under subpoena, together with Mr. Ismay, would not be allowed to depart. Captain Rostrom told a simple, apparently straightforward story, thrilling from its very simplicity, and the sailorman quality of the narrative. He answered questions direct, and gave the first authoritative tale of the hearing of the appeal for help, the rush to aid the sinking liner, and the sighting of the ship's boats, and picking them up, the preparations made, while the Carpathia was being urged along, under every ounce of steam its boilers could make, to provide for the reception of the survivors on board. Captain Rostrom denied emphatically there was any intention on his part to disregard the inquiry made by the President of the United States, or that any censorship was exercised over wireless messages by any person other than himself. Charles W. Lightholder, second officer of the Titanic, and senior surviving officer of the ship, told of what preceded the sinking of the Titanic, what happened while women were taken away in boats, as brave men stood by, and what happened when the Titanic took her last dip. It was a story of heroism, told quietly and calmly. Lightholder said that tests of the water had been made for ice. It was part of the routine. Water was taken from the side of the ship, in canvas buckets, and the temperature learned by putting a thermometer in it. As the second officer of the ship, Lightholder said, he had been in charge of it on Sunday when the Titanic struck, from 6 o'clock in the evening, until 10, or inside of 2 hours before the collision. He would not admit that the tests were being made solely for the purpose of searching for information as to icebergs. It was part of the routine of the ship. The tests were made for routing purposes and other purposes. The water was not much above freezing. The witness said that he did not know what the tests of the water that day showed. No reports had been made to him. He did not think it necessary that night, when he was on the bridge in charge, to make tests for the purpose of finding out if the Titanic was in the vicinity of icebergs. Did you know that the America had reported to the Titanic the location of icebergs in that neighborhood? Asked Senator Smith. I heard of the message, but I didn't know that it was the America. Did you get from Captain Smith that night any information about the icebergs? Not that night, said Lightholder. I think it was in the afternoon, about 1 o'clock. I was on the bridge, having relieved First Officer Murdoch, who had gone to lunch. Captain Smith, he said, told him of the wireless message from the America, about the icebergs. Lightholder said, he couldn't recall just what position the ship was in then, but he could work it out on the chart. When Chief Officer Murdoch returned to the bridge, Lightholder said, he told him exactly the information Captain Smith had communicated to him. What did Murdoch say? Asked Senator Smith. All right, replied Lightholder. So, the chief officer of the ship was fully advised by you that you were in proximity to icebergs? He was asked. Yes, sir. How fast was the boat going at that time? Between 21.5 and 22 knots. Was that her maximum speed? So far as we knew, said Lightholder, she could go faster than that, if pushed. We understood that was not her maximum speed. During your voyage, did you know you were in the vicinity of ice? Senator Smith asked. I knew some had been reported. He said the ship was not in proximity to icebergs, Saturday or Sunday, although he knew the ship would be near ice on Sunday night. The witness said he knew nothing of the America and the Titanic talking by wireless about icebergs. Senator Smith asked if he sought to send any wireless messages from the Titanic after she struck. He said not. Turning to the subject of lifeboats, Mr. Ismay said he heard the captain give the order to lower the boats. I then left the bridge. 3 boats, he said, he saw lowered and filled. In his own boat were 4 members of the crew and 45 passengers. Was there any jostling or attempt by men to get into the boats? Asked Senator Smith. I saw none. How were the women selected? We picked the women and children as they stood nearest the rail. Representative Hughes handed Senator Smith a note, and then the chairman told Mr. Ismay that it was reported that the second lifeboat left without its full complement of oarsmen, and from 11:30 until 7:30, women were forced to row the boat. I know nothing about it. Representative Hughes' daughter was in this boat and was assigned to watch the cork in the boat, and, if it came out, to use her finger as a stopper. Then Senator Smith asked the circumstances under which he left the boat. The boat was being filled, began Mr. Ismay. The officers called out to know if there were any more women to go. There were none. No passengers were on the deck. So as the boat was being lowered, I got into it. The ship was sinking. Asked Senator Smith. The boat was sinking, almost whispered Mr. Ismay. Was there any attempt to lower the boats of the Carpathia to take on passengers after you went aboard her? Asked Senator Smith. There were no passengers there to take on, said Mr. Ismay. He said he saw no life rafts in the sea. How many lifeboats were there on the Titanic? 20 altogether, I think, said Mr. Ismay, 16 collapsible, and 4 wooden boats. Whether the boats were taken on board the Carpathia or not, he did not know. It has been suggested, Senator Smith continued, that 2 of the lifeboats sank as soon as lowered. Do you know anything about that? I do not. I never heard of it, and I think all the lifeboats were accounted for. When you last saw her, were there indications that the Titanic had broken in 2? No, there was no such indication. How long after you left her was it that you looked back for the last time? It may have been 10 minutes, or a half hour. I am not sure. Impossible for me to tell. Was there confusion apparent on the Titanic when you looked back? I didn't see any. All I saw was the green light the last time I looked. After you left Captain Smith on the bridge, did you see him again? I did not. Did you have any message from him? None. How many wireless operators were there on the Titanic? I presume there were two. One is always on watch. Did they survive? I have been told one did, but I do not know whether it is true or not. Mr. Ismay was asked what he had on when he got into the lifeboat. A pair of slippers, a pair of pajamas, a suit of clothes, and an overcoat. Captain Rostrom, of the Carpathia, followed Mr. Ismay. He told Mr. Smith that he had been captain of the Carpathia since last January, but that he had been a seaman 27 years. The captain told in detail of the arrangements made to prepare the lifeboats and the ship for the receipt of the survivors. Arriving at the zone of the accident, Captain Rostrom testified he saw an iceberg straight ahead of him and, stopping at 4 a.m., 10 minutes later, he picked up the first lifeboat. The officer sang out, he had only one seaman on board, and was having difficulty in manning his boat. By the time I got the boat aboard, day was breaking, said the captain. In a radius of 4 miles, I saw all the other lifeboats. On all sides of us were icebergs, some 20, some were 150 to 200 feet high, and numerous small icebergs, or growlers. Wreckage was strewn about us. At 8:30, all the Titanic's survivors were aboard. Then, with tears filling his eyes, Captain Rostrom said, he called the purser. I told him, said Captain Rostrom, I wanted to hold a service of prayer, thanksgiving for the living, and a funeral service for the dead. I went to Mr. Ismay. He told me to take full charge. An Episcopal clergyman was found among the passengers, and he conducted the services. As the prayers were being said, Captain Rostrom testified, he was on the bridge searching for survivors. He told of talking with the California, which had arrived. As he searched the sea, one body with a life preserver on floated by. The man was dead, probably a member of the crew, the captain said. The body was not picked up, the officer explaining, because the survivors of the Titanic were in no condition then to see a body brought aboard. But I must say, declared Captain Rostrom, Whitley positiveness, every one of the survivors behaved magnificently. They sat in the boats until the order came for them to mount the ladder in turn, and then came up. Asked about the lifeboats, Captain Rostrom said he found one among the wreckage in the sea. Several of the lifeboats brought in on the Carpathia to New York, he said, were lowered last night and hauled away by tenders, he knew not where. Captain Rostrom said that the Carpathia had 20 lifeboats of her own, in accordance with the British regulations. Wouldn't that indicate that the regulations are out of date, your ship being much smaller than the Titanic, which also carried 20 lifeboats? Senator Smith asked. No. The Titanic was supposed to be a lifeboat herself. Captain Rostrom then explained that it was for the good of the shipwrecked people that he brought his ship to New York, instead of going to Halifax. At Representative Hughes' suggestion, Captain Rostrom was asked further about the lifeboat with one officer and one seaman in it. This was the boat from which the representative's daughter was rescued. At least 2 women were rowing in this boat. In another lifeboat, he saw women at the oars, but how many, he could not tell. In discussing the strength of the Carpathia's wireless, Captain Rostrom said, the Carpathia was only 58 miles from the Titanic when the call for help came. Our wireless operator was not on duty, said Captain Rostrom, but as he was undressing, he had his apparatus to his ear. 10 minutes later, he would have been in bed, and we never would have heard. Mr. Marconi took the stand as soon as the hearing was resumed for the afternoon. He said he was the chairman of the British Marconi Company. Under instructions of the company, he said operators must take their orders from the captain of the ship on which they are employed. Do the regulations prescribe whether 1 or 2 operators should be aboard the ocean vessels. Yes, on ships like the Titanic and Olympic, 2 are carried, said Mr. Marconi. The Carpathia, a smaller boat, carries 1. The Carpathia's wireless apparatus is a short-distance equipment. The maximum efficiency of the Carpathia's wireless, I should say, was 200 miles. The wireless equipment on the Titanic was available 500 miles during the daytime, and 1,000 miles at night. Do you consider that the Titanic was equipped with the latest, improved wireless apparatus? Yes, I should say that it had the very best. Charles Herbert Lightholder, second officer of the Titanic, followed Mr. Marconi on the stand. Mr. Lightholder said he understood the maximum speed of the Titanic, as shown by its trial tests, to have been 22.5 to 23 knots. Senator Smith asked if the rule requiring life-saving apparatus to be in each room, for each passenger, was complied with. Everything was complete, said Lightholder. 16 lifeboats, of which 4 were collapsible, were on the Titanic, he added. During the tests, he said, Captain Clark, of the British Board of Trade, was aboard the Titanic to inspect its life-saving equipment. How thorough are these captains of the Board of Trade in inspecting ships? Asked Senator Smith. Captain Clark is so thorough that we called him a nuisance. Lightholder said he was in the sea with a lifebelt on, 1 hour and a half. What time did you leave the ship? I didn't leave it. Did it leave you? Yes, sir. Where were you when the Titanic sank? In the officers' quarters. Were all the lifeboats gone then? All but 1. I was about 15 feet from it. It was hanging in the tackle, and they were trying to get it over the bulwarks, the last time I saw it. The first officer, Mr. Murdoch, who lost his life, was managing the tackle. The last boat, a flat collapsible, to put off, was the one on top the officers' quarters, Lightholder said. Men jumped upon it on deck, and waited for the water to float it off. Once at sea, it upset. The forward funnel fell into the water, just missing the raft, and overturning it. The funnel probably killed persons in the water. This was the boat I eventually got on, declared Lightholder. No one was on it when I reached it. Later about 30 men clambered out of the water onto it. All had on life preservers. Did any passengers get on? Asked Senator Smith. J.B. Thayer, the second Marconi operator, and Colonel Gracie, I recall, said the witness. All the rest were firemen, taken out of the water. 2 of these died that night, and slipped off into the water. I think the senior Marconi operator did that. Did you see any attempt to get women to go, who would not? Yes. Why would they not go? I hadn't time to learn. Did any ask for their family to go? Yes, 1 or 2. Did any families go? No. In the first boat to put off, Lightholder said, he put 20 to 25. 2 seamen were placed in it. The officer said he could spare no more, and that the fact that women rowed did not show the boat was not fully equipped. At that time, he did not believe the danger was great. 2 seamen, placed in the boat he said, were selected by him, but he could not recall who they were. The third boat. By the time I came to the third boat, all these on the port side, I began to realize that the situation was serious, and I began to take chances. How long did all the work of loading and lowering a lifeboat take? It was difficult to say, but I think about 15 or 20 minutes. How many passengers did the third boat contain? I filled it up, as full as I dared, sir, then lowered it, about 35 I think. The women and children couldn't have stood quieter if they'd been in church. In loading the fourth lifeboat, Lightholder said, he was running short of seamen. I put 2 seamen in, and 1 jumped out. That was the first boat, I had to put a man passenger in. He was standing nearby, and said he would go, if I needed him. I said, are you a sailor? And he replied, that he was a yachtsman. Then I told him that, if he was sailor enough, to get out over the bulwarks to the lifeboat, to go ahead. He did and proved himself afterward, to be a very brave man. Who was he? Did you know him? I didn't know him then, but afterward, I looked him up. He was Major Pucan, of Toronto. Had you ever seen him before? Never. Of the 5th boat, Lightholder had no particular recollection. The last boat I put out, my 6th boat, he said, we had difficulty finding women. I called for women, and none were on deck. The men began to get in, and then women appeared. As rapidly as they did, the men passengers got out of the boats again. The boat's deck was only 10 feet from the water when I lowered the 6th boat. When we lowered the first, the distance to the water was 70 feet. All told, Lightholder testified, 210 members of the crew were saved. Lightholder declared, he stood on top the officers' quarters, and as the ship dived, he faced forward and dived also. I was sucked against a blower, and held there, testified the officer. Head above water. No, sir. A terrific gust came up the blower. The boilers must have exploded, and I was blown clear. How far were you blown? Barely clear. I was sucked down again, this time on the fiddly grating. Did anyone else have a similar experience? Yes, Colonel Gracie. How did you get loose? I don't know, maybe another explosion. All one know is, we came up by a boat. Were there any watertight compartments on that ship? The senator asked. Certainly, 40 or 50. Thomas Cottam, 21 years old, of Liverpool, the Marconi operator on the Carpathia, was the first witness at the evening session. He denied himself some glory by saying he had no stated hours for labor on the Carpathia. Previous witnesses had testified he was not on duty when he received the Titanic's signal for help. He was decidedly uncertain whether he was required to work at night, finally saying it depended on whether he had commercial or ship's business to get off. What were you doing last Sunday evening, about 10 o'clock? Asked Senator Smith. Receiving news from Cape Cod, said Cottam. He said, he had also been sending a lot of messages for the Titanic. Had you closed your station for the night? No. What do you do when you close your station? Switch the storage battery out, said Cottam. Does that prevent receiving or sending messages? The senator continued. No. Does it lessen the likelihood of your getting a signal of any kind? No, not in the least, Cottam replied. You say, the Carpathia wireless instruments would send a message about 250 miles with accuracy. Yes, sir. Was there any thunder or lightning Sunday night? No, it was clear. Well, how did you happen to catch the Titanic message of distress? I was looking out for a confirmation by the steamer Parisian of a previous message from the Parisian, a message that came sometime in the afternoon. Did you hear the captain of the Carpathia testify here today? No. He said, you were about to retire, and caught this Titanic distress message, rather providentially. Yes, sir. How far had you got along in your arrangement to retire? Had you taken off your clothes? Yes, my coat. Did you have any instruments then? Yes, the telephones were on my head. I was waiting for the Parisian's answer. I had just called it. How long would you have waited? Several minutes. Would you have retired pretty soon, you think? Yes. Well, when you got the distress message from the Titanic, Sunday night, how did you get it? I called the Titanic myself, sir. Who told you to call the Titanic? No one, sir. I did it of my own free will. I asked the Titanic operator if he was aware that Cape Cod had been sending messages for the Titanic. What was the answer? Come at once was the message, sir, said Cottam. Was that all of it? No, the operator said, I think, come at once, this is a distress message. C.Q.D. Cottam testified. When word of the Titanic's distress was received, operator Cottam said, he immediately sent them the position of the Carpathia, and added that they would hurry to the rescue. Get any reply to that? Asked Senator Smith. Yes, sir, immediately. They acknowledged receipt of it. The witness said, the next communication with the Titanic was 4 minutes later, when he confirmed the position of both vessels. At this juncture the Frankfurt, of the North German Lloyd Line, broke in on the communication, having heard the Titanic's call for help. Later, the steamship Olympic also replied. What did you do then? Asked Senator Smith. I called the attention of the Titanic to the Olympic's efforts to raise it, answered the witness. The Titanic replied, it could not hear, because of the rush of air, and the noise made by the escaping steam. Immediately after telling the Titanic of the Olympic's attempt to get in communication with her, the former, the witness said, sought the Olympic's aid, reporting that it was head down and giving its position. The Baltic broke in at this time, but its efforts to reach the Titanic were without avail. I was in communication with the Titanic at regular intervals until the final message, said Cottam. This was, come quick, our engine room is filling up to the boilers. What was your condition? Asked Senator Smith. I was desperately tired. I was worked out, answered Cottam, who was then excused. The committee adjourned at 10:20 o'clock, to meet at 10 o'clock, the next morning. If you are enjoying Ambience World's narration of the sinking of the Titanic, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, so that you will not miss out on the next chapters.